Ever since 2016, there's been this persistent myth about Bernie Sanders' support base, specifically that he only is able to cultivate support among straight white males. He doesn't appeal to women, he doesn't appeal to people of color, he doesn't appeal to sexual minorities, he only appeals to straight white males. Now, this myth, regardless of how disingenuous it is, regardless of poll after poll showing that Bernie Sanders has a higher approval rating among women and people of color, the myth just won't die. I thought we were able to put it to rest earlier when more than one poll confirmed that the Bernie bro myth is bullshit, but it won't die, and it's because it's a really convenient way to smear and discredit Bernie Sanders. Now, let's talk about the origin of the Bernie bro myth, because it was manufactured in part by then Labor Secretary Tom Perez, who is currently the DNC chairman, because he didn't like, and a lot of Hillary Clinton officials didn't like, the fact that Bernie Sanders was taking so much support among millennials. So the way that Clinton campaign officials were able to reclaim that narrative was that, well, you know, Bernie Sanders may be getting a lot of support among millennials, but he's only getting support among white male millennials. Now, to be fair, it wasn't just Tom Perez, because the media also tried to propagate this myth. Even though this myth was incredibly disingenuous, Bernie Sanders did struggle with black voters back in 2016, but I speculated that that wasn't necessarily due to him not having a message that appeals to them. Rather, it was due to a lack of name recognition, and as time passed and more voters got to know who Bernie Sanders was and what he stood for, I was proven right, because multiple polls, as I stated earlier, began to show that Bernie Sanders didn't just have support among white males, but most of his support actually came from women and people of color. But that didn't stop pundits from still spreading the Bernie bro myth. In fact, it's still being spread, because as recently as December 13th, the New York Times' Jonathan Martin incorrectly stated that Bernie Sanders has struggled to expand his appeal beyond his base of primarily white supporters. It's infuriating to hear them still say this, because Bernie Sanders actually he has the strongest approval ratings among women and people of color, but they're still saying this regardless because of how he performed in 2016, when nobody really knew who Bernie Sanders was, because Hillary Clinton had all the name recognition in the world. Now, this particular article and that line specifically led to an explosive debate on a recent episode of TYT, where Cenk Uygur and John Iadarola defended Bernie Sanders from what they perceived was a smear, and I agree with them. But Michael Shore on that same panel claimed that approval rating wasn't a sufficient indicator to declare that Bernie Sanders had broadened his support base since 2016. But Cenk Uygur on that panel correctly pointed out that there hasn't been a vote since 2016, so you don't have any other indicator to use but approval rating. So if you want to know how Bernie Sanders is faring among different demographics, you have no choice but to use approval rating, and it makes more sense to cite approval ratings than old data, that sounded redundant, but data from 2016. So the problem with Michael Shore's argument is that he's kind of lending cover to an establishment who has a vested interest in smearing Bernie Sanders, because they don't really have another way of combating his popularity at this point. So what they're trying to do is discredit him yet again. However, on the same day TYT published this video, another poll was released, this time by CNN and SSRS, that proved yet again that Cenk and John were correct. And as Katie Halper points out in an article for Common Dreams about this specific poll, how come so many Bernie bros are women and people of color? Despite data to the contrary, the media continues to distort Sanders' politics and the diversity of his supporters. Now, I actually want to stop and take the time to read portions of Katie Halper's article, because it really is a great read. Because as more and more data lends evidence to the opposite of what they're claiming, this Bernie bro myth is becoming more and more egregious, because they are producing misinformation by trying to perpetuate this myth that Bernie Sanders' main support base is white males. Now, Katie Halper writes, a recent CNN poll shows that among potential Democratic candidates in Iowa caucuses, Senator Bernie Sanders has the highest approval rating from people of color, and the diversity of the Sanders-inspired left was on display at the Sanders-inspired Institute gathering in Burlington, Vermont earlier this month, which I covered on my podcast, The Katie Halper Show. But empirical evidence has not stopped much of the corporate press, including many liberal or progressive outlets and commentators, from condemning the senator as having a race problem. Over the past week, we saw Jonathan Martin of the New York Times, who happens to be white, claimed that Sanders has done little to broaden his political circle and has struggled to expand his appeal beyond his base of primarily white supporters. Meanwhile, Clara Jeffrey, the editor-in-chief of Mother Jones, also white, recently presented not only Sanders supporters, but the left movement in general as white, linking to a written exchange between two splinter journalists about Sanders, she tweeted, in which white lefties have a debate that somehow does not discuss the fact that Bernie has no real purchase among the POC base of the Democratic Party, and that problem has not improved for him. If anything, it seems larger. Sanders critics smear him as blinded by straight white male privilege. The mere mention of class gets Sanders and others condemned as class reductionists. The irony is that many of the most vocal critics attacking him for being insufficiently intersectional fail to address class altogether as an aspect of identity. It's cruel, immoral, and politically disastrous to dismiss the experience of working class people of all colors and backgrounds, but even those who openly mock the concerns of the white working class undermine their own alleged commitment to marginalized voices when they ignore the diversity of Sanders supporters. By ignoring the people of all ages, backgrounds, genders, sexuality, and ethnicity who support Sanders, they engage in the very erasure and marginalization of the women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and all the intersections thereof that they claim to oppose. And that is specifically why I wanted to share this article from Katie Halper, because she nails exactly why this is problematic. The Bernie bro myth and people really perpetuating this Bernie bro myth are inherently hypocritical because they are erasing the voices of people who they claim they don't want to be erased. And understand that you need to stop disaggregating issues related to race and class because these are inextricably linked. And if we want to actually form a coalition that will be successful politically, it has to be a diverse coalition of women, people of color, men. It has to be everyone. So basically, the takeaway is that Bernie Sanders, he has a message that is broadly appealing, and as a result, and it's not surprising that his message is broadly appealing, but as a result, well, the people who support him are very diverse. It includes women, people of color, sexual minorities. People support Bernie Sanders because he has policies that will help their lives. At the end of the day, shame on anyone who perpetuates this Bernie bro myth because it's just not validated by empirical reality. So they're spreading misinformation by parroting this point about Bernie Sanders only having support among straight white males and not being able to broaden his support base, because the opposite is true. Clearly, he's broadened his support base, and for you to not acknowledge that, it's clear that you're either uninformed or disingenuous.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.